I have known happiness because a life is never just one thing, and while it might not amount to much when my time is considered as a whole, it remains significant for me. Romance excited my young days in a way that made them seem so much better than they were. A hot, burning sun that flared for a brief while to an intensity that left me forever scorched. That it wasn't both-sided, that what I'd felt hadn't been necessarily returned hurts, but time's passing has made me realise that it was in no way less real for its shortfalls. And I live now for my children, because when I had nothing, I had them, and I knew that I was all they had. To have lasted into old age makes me feel at times as if death has forgotten me, as if I'll be the one to somehow beat the trick. If that sounds like a blessing, it's not. I'm tired, have been for years, but lately I feel spent. I get up in the morning, still wanting sleep, and I lie awake deep into the night, trying to ignore all the things that have remained at bay during daytime hours, but which come at me once the house has turned quiet. Will the grave be any different? Maybe that's the hell priests talk so much about. Hell might be the ceaseless repetition of who we are during our lowest moments, with our mistakes, the ones that have defined us, playing over and over to goad us for all eternity. But I hold on to the consolation that whether heaven or hell awaits me, at least I'll be lying down for it. Like I said, I'm tired. I was 19 when I met Michael Egan for the first time. That's not where my story begins, but it's where I begin. That day, the beginning of my happiness and the start of my fall. Every significant moment of my life is a page in a pile that 100 or 1,000 years from now can be tossed in the air and recounted from at random as they fall. I am the picture in any order, but Michael Egan, whether absent or otherwise, is the consistency that gives me shape. In the end, you were left with no choice. It had to be then, it had to be there. And it worked out for the best. You knew that when you heard her car stop so close to where you were hiding, the clunk of the locks when she pressed the key fob, the jangle of keys when she tripped past without seeing you. When you were sure that you were the only one listening, the only one watching. She called out your name, impatient when she got no reply, abrasive in her final seconds, giving you the strength you needed, the certainty that what you were doing was right. She pushed the door open fully and walked toward the light. Candlelight, warm, cozy. You congratulated yourself on that little touch afterwards. But the instant her toe crossed the threshold, you were all action. Every cell and sinew focused on the task at hand. Silently, you moved behind her, matched her step for step, your quarry, your prey, and you raised your arms high above her head, double grip, and no scream escaped her, no cry, only an involuntary exhalation of breath. Her dying. Later, they called it a frenzied attack, and that bothered you because it was so far from the truth, because you'd planned it down to the last detail, because as soon as it was done, you stopped, stood, took the bundle of baby wipes from your pocket and rubbed the biological evidence from your face and the cheap hooded rain jacket and the waterproof trousers and the rubber boots and the latex gloves, all brand new, all disposable. Then you cleaned the sharpened claw hammer and put it and the soiled baby wipes into the black plastic bag and stepped backwards out the door. You checked carefully for footprints and any other traces you might have left. There were none.
Thank you so much, guys. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Rosie. Oh my God. Yeah, it's like she's been inside my head. She has the pauses in all the right spots, and she did a brilliant job.
Elizabeth, I woke at 4 this morning calling your name, shouting it out to the empty bedroom. You had just left, or so it seemed to me, your presence in the dark room still palpable, your departing spirit waking me up. Such cruelty to leave me in this hollowed out place. I sat up, fully awake, despite all the whiskey, and I thought, so I'm still alive. I wonder if I should feel grateful. Now I lie here and watch the first touch of light creep along the edge of the curtain, and I wonder why I am not dead yet. Like you, dead all these years. It seems impossible that you are dead 20 years. It seems to me you just left this room, staying a moment to wake me up and then abandon me. All I want to do is dream of you again while I lie here and wait for the dawn. My dream, it's very simple. The roses in Regent's Park, a summer's day. You lying on the grass, elegant, smoking gracefully, telling me about your latest book. My dream of you, of us. I had another dream last week, rows of your books on a shelf before me. I stood before them thinking, Elizabeth, Bitha, if I read them all, would I find you? Are you hidden there? Or are the books themselves unraveling? Was I the flaw in your story? You were always stronger than me, the cruel strength of the writer, telling our story, our dream of each other, my dream of you. The last day at Bowen's Court, although we didn't know it was the last day.
Ava, congratulations and thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much. Great. Lovely. Thanks, everyone. And what a wonderful way to come out of the last 2 years. And huge thanks to Madeline and to Danielle for this. And lovely to see you, everyone.
Thank you, Rosie. It's been brilliant so far. We're giving Rosie a slight rest now and again. This is a reading from Liberty Terrace by Madeleine Darcy. That's me. And it's from a story called The Callanans. Bernice stood in her mother's bedroom, holding a large bottle of body lotion aloft in her right hand. Her mother, Mrs. Vivian Callanan, sat on the bed, both arms folded, and her general demeanour that of a sulky teenager caught smoking. She was wearing her best coat and a matching scarf. A carry-on suitcase sat next to Mrs. Callanan, its contents spilling out onto the duvet. I told you already you can only bring liquids of 100 millilitres or less, Bernice said. Sure, they'll never notice if I wrap it up in my dressing gown. Mrs. Callanan, arms still folded, shrugged her shoulders and looked up at Bernice. They would. Bernice placed the bottle of body lotion firmly on her mother's dressing table. Look, we can buy you some in the duty-free, she said, turning her attention back to the suitcase. Or when we get there. I've paid for our flights, haven't we? I should be able to take what I want, Mrs. Callanan said, fingering her scarf. It's to prevent terrorists from blowing up the plane. Bernice opened her mouth to say something else, but thought better of it. Instead, she rolled up a jumper and placed it carefully back in the case. Downstairs, the front doorbell rang. Oh God, that must be the taxi, said Bernice. She raced out of the bedroom and shouted down the stairs. Colin, will you answer the door? If it's the taxi, tell him to wait a few minutes. Colin was Bernice's only sibling. The only job she'd asked of him was to keep an eye out for the taxi. She returned to her mother's bedroom and began to hurriedly repack the bag. This was the third time she had had to edit her mother's luggage. The first was 2 weeks ago, when her mother had shown her a large suitcase filled with enough items to see her through an Arctic voyage. The second was last week, when Bernice supplied her with a smart carry-on case. The third was today, shortly before they were due to leave for the airport. They were only going to Paris for the weekend. Oh.
1995. The sun beat down from the cloudless sky. Mary shielded her eyes from its glare as she crossed the street. Cork City was busy. It always was on a Saturday. Teenagers loitered around shop fronts. Women scurried past with large bags full of shopping and designer handbags. And buskers played Beatle songs, nodding and winking when someone threw a coin into the open guitar case on the pavement. Her long blonde hair swung from side to side, tied up in a ponytail with a black bobble. Tall and slim, she was dressed in her favourite Levi 501s and her black Doc Marten boots. Her t-shirt had a large tongue printed on the front, the Rolling Stones logo, and her blue eyes were accentuated by black eyeliner. Her earphones were nestled in her ears, playing music she had recorded from the radio the night before. The DJ had talked over the intro of her favourite song, but she had managed to get most of it, her finger poised over the record button of her tape recorder. She really wanted a CD player, but her dad could barely afford the rent, let alone a luxury like that. Humming a Nirvana song, she crossed St. Patrick's Bridge and headed up towards McCurtain Street, where she had arranged to meet her best friend. Mary Kennedy was an only child. Her mother died of breast cancer when she was 7 years old, so all she had was her dad, Noel. He was a builder by trade, but had given up work when he hurt his back 3 years before. The weekly benefit he received was barely enough to make ends meet, so Mary had been waitressing since she was 13 to earn some extra cash. They lived in a small terraced house near the famous Shandon Bells Church, just north of the River Lee. Mary tried her best with the housekeeping. She had taught herself to cook from her mam's cookbooks. She kept an eye on special offers at the supermarket and bought the best, cheapest cuts of meat to keep costs down. Minced beef was their staple diet. She would mix it with gravy and peas one day and make a shepherd's pie the next. On a Sunday, she would roast a small chicken, just like her mom used to do when she was a little girl. Despite money being tight, Noel liked to have a punt on the horses now and then. Mary only heard about it when he won. "Go and buy yourself some new clothes," an elated Noel would say, handing her £20. "You deserve it, love." Mary would nod, but instead of going down to Patrick Street and blowing the lot, she would stash the money in a shoebox under her bed. She always kept as much as possible as a rainy day fund. Sometimes the electricity bill was overdue, or all they had to eat was cornflakes. She understood that of the two of them, she had better sense when it came to money. Her dad didn't mean to be so flighty. It was just his way. He had the kindest heart and she adored him. She understood how hard it was to raise a daughter all by himself. Because of this, she tried to cause as little trouble as possible. It wasn't his fault that his back troubled him and that he spent a fair share of their money in the local pub. He loved her, and that was all that mattered. And now, from Tied to the Wind by Afric McGlinchey, 2 extracts. 1, aged 5, Blurred Walls and Nights, Lusaka, Zambia. Through my open window, at tenderly green things growing, wet earth aroma, the summer storm eyeing from its far edge now, and brief on my cheek, the soft pelt of my mum's mink, and I touch her silver dress, which blinks, many-eyed, the fringe at the hem swishing left, right, left, and her good night tinkles across the ting-ting of water dripping from the eaves, and then she's gone, leaving the air of her scent like the last notes of a song, and I'm lifting my head to the sill to watch as she swims with my bow-tied father into the glittering street. 6, aged 15. Echoes in the muffled corridor. Saturday, Salisbury, Rhodesia, pre-independent Zimbabwe. A wardrobe for a lock. The fireball sun breaches the barricade of the window. I watch pods fall from the tree outside my window like parachutists coming in for a landing. Leaves flounce and skim the wall. Yesterday, the euphoria of the endless weekend ahead. Now, empty hands, leaden feet, greasy hair. Outside my door, still no Ivor, the only person I could bear to talk to. I crumple across the bed like a wet sheet being shaken out, spend the time writing until my pencil's a nub, rub out sentences, create charcoal clouds. I have seen how alcohol distorts. She didn't mean me. She doesn't hate me. She meant Dad. Haul myself up again to inspect my cacti menagerie on the sill. Morning heat has glassed into them, a bulge of sudden growth from one. They prickle and wait for me to tell them what happened. When I do, they stare, remain silent. Out in the garden, birds lift from a dog rush into the immensity of sky. Even Fred has abandoned me. There he is, outside, lapping at the pool's blueness with his long, flapping tongue. Gloomily, I reflect on a found owl's feather recently added to my collection. My glass of water. I lift it, gulp 10 times. Is being in this room an action? Or is it a feeling? A statement? There seems to be no good answer. Eventually, I lie on the floor, do my homework, write a letter to Freya, although what I say to her is only what I want her to know. Outside, everything is in full motion, summer at its blooming height. Molly and Zoe and the Jane Blondes are splashing and laughing. I stare at my 3 selves in the 3-way mirror. I look shattered, aggrieved. My injured pride stretching me all the way through the long morning, longer afternoon, twilight, and darker night.
Thanks, everyone. It's lovely to meet all the other authors today. Thanks for presenting. Rosie, you're brilliant.
I goscailt an dorastam. Fecim gur fótarí crotanta is mó a ha íon tórna seo na má goscailte. Sim in na masc agus ordíam deoch. Ní ólim de gná, nó bíam mearúil mo chóhan ar an gané, agus cumalum an jobh. Ní fada nó go mí me gwydachta vert claidrí atá ar an ddraulás leis an dar seachtainna. Cúr lena méil agus iad ag rada briléise lom. Tásúla dasa agat a dar an brian claire héan lom. Bhí brean fósán ar sa champánach sé le banantí, agus ag scuba hart ag balú chluní. Éiste lebeda ar sa siise leis, nó beag tú an mu ar an tráid. Idir se fóid na berta seo, agus an cúpla vodka atá cata síral gan féin. Ní fada nó go muinfir do mo bhile mé. Tásúla das agat ar sa brian a ríis, lámh a legan ar mo glúan aige an iireacht seo. Tásúla dasa agat féin a d'eirim. Súla slána atá aige in áíire ar nós pric, iad fuair mar a bhánta. Sáin sé a ladairt sa scéal inis. An seasigh tú deoch dúing, níl cent fága go a stór. Cá bhfuil cónaí ort? Tuige? Nach rifa bhaile le cúpla euro a bhalú. Higling sesiún ceart a grú an sin, cin seola atá agat. An bóthar can na batha, no junk mail is anam don teach. A níomh a crí tá tú ar mira. Cad faoi fami ystadi? Cad fuhu? Nach meach rud éigean le sparál a cosan. Beg mam sa labba go fóil a stóca. Ach beg a sparán sa chófra, agus ciste na seachtainna an. Buinem lámh bhríon de mo glúin is Irene. Cogar a níomh a d'ir sé lam. Má tá peolarí ar bis a teach, éon rud an éair, bear leat iad a chomá. Cuican sé súil arm agus aisteach go leor. Sa lítar in istam go bhfuil an túil céanna sin tar éis mé a leanúnt an doras amach. Ras go slí hánta an bhric. Ar falúan san éarrón is mí ag trasnú an bóthir.
One day, Bully the Bee heard two students talk about their next class, which was about bees. She was so curious that she followed them to learn more. Bully learned that bees helped plants to grow and produce food. This made her proud to be a bee. She had never known how important bees were to the world. There was bad news, though. The wise teacher explained that the number of bees in the world was getting smaller, and that was very bad news for everyone. Bully knew something had to be done. She spread her wings and flew behind the quad. She landed at a bridge by the river where she met a strange creature. He was swimming in the river nearby. "Hello, little bee," said the creature. "Nice to meet you. I haven't seen you before." "Lovely to meet you," replied Bully. "And what would you be?" she asked politely. "I've never seen your kind before." "Ollie the Otter is my name, and welcome to my playground. I come here to play. I love to look at the wonderful flowers here that Jack the gardener has planted. This meadow garden is for us wildlife. We love to play our part." "I am trying to find my part," said Booley. I don't really have anything to do.
Don't look so sad, little bee. Perhaps if you visit the bees at the North Mall, they might be able to cheer you up.
Ollie waved at Booley and splish splash dived back into the river and began swimming as fast as he could. Booley had never seen so many flowers. They all looked like they were smiling. Booley looked at a map of the campus and flew across the river and over the humpback bridge to the North Mall. She looked around and could see hundreds of bees flying speedily from flower to flower. Are you going to laze about, or are you going to help? Said a bee who looked slightly annoyed. Everyone here has a part to play, said another bee, smiling at Booley. All of us here work very hard, said the bee, except Bingo, the drone. He always takes it easy. Booley looked around and saw a red-faced bee stretched out, sunbathing on a stone. What kind of bee are you? She asked.
We are worker bees,
said the pretty bee, whose name was Bella.
We gather pollen, which feeds our hives where we do our best work.
Bella brought Booley to see the hives, where she met an important bee who explained how honey is made. The bee was wearing a crown, so Booley knew that she was, in fact, a queen.
Thank you very much.
You're very
Mrs.
welcome,
Quinn.
thank
I really
you.
enjoyed that.
Good stuff.
1857, Harriet in Mr. Butler's office. Ain't it strange how time can be squeezed backwards to when you was a child, just by the slightest thing, snatch of a song, the smooth warmth of a wooden toy, the way an apple may tumble from a cart and roll just so, or the smell of ink on paper. Baba's ink on his papers, what he wrote himself. That whiff of pickled walnuts were a potion, pulling me into the past, away from the dark panelled office and Mr. Butler fussing with papers on his hulking desk and talking of bequests and land deeds. Instead, I were picturing my Baba, sitting at his table, a half moon it were called, lovely, his quill in hand, waiting for his memories to walk past the window or tap on the pane. My Baba. For so I called my father, and that, not like the other names he were given, that at least were at his own bidding. Baba's quill scratching across the paper, each word bringing a bead of sweat to his brow, a tremor to his hand. A clock doled out the time, 6 dongs. Its face were smug and pale behind the glass. I lifted one of the sheets of paper that sat on my lap and pressed my nose to it, breathed in the dusty past of it. That must have been one of the last batches of ink that he made. A drawer were scraped opened. I looked up. Mr. Butler took out an envelope, placed it on the desk in front of him with a fussy flicker of his fingers. I made no remark, just continued to look through some of the pages what he'd given me earlier. My Baba's pictures, papers, written a half-century before. I couldn't take it all in. Them words, his words, inked on the paper. Tap, tap. He were tapping the bloody envelope now. Miss Small, I beg your pardon, but if I may, well, now you've started, you may as well say what you have to say. His eyes swirled large behind his spectacles. He offered to read through my Baba's papers with me, said he could explain them. given the writing might present a challenge to me, and he cleared his throat that some of the language, being old-fashioned, may need, again, a small amount of simplification and whatnot. There's no need for your help, I told him, while getting to my feet. I am perfectly capable of reading. I smiled at him then, for really, he were not the worst of his kind. Oh, he begged my pardon, regretted his presumption, said as how it was not on account of my... Then he stopped, couldn't bring himself to go on, and his pale face fired up. Don't fuss yourself, Mr. Butler, said I. Sure, how could you know anything about me save what you see of me and hear me say? He dipped his head, pleaded with me to indulge in one whim. Please allow me to read aloud Lady Lucy's final letter. She dictated it to me shortly before she died. Her sight, you know, was almost gone. He rubbed his eyes at this, then turned to light 2 of them fancy gas lamps, and while they hissed and flickered, he plucked a letter from the envelope. I saw it were trimmed in black. He coughed, adjusted his spectacles, and began to read.
And now, thank you so much, Rosie. Now we're going to take a short break of about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll be back with the next part of our readings. Thanks so much, everyone, especially Rosie, and we'll see you again in a few minutes.
Okay, so the next excerpt is from somebody I'm very conscious of the fact that they're really good at reading their own work, so pinch of salt with this one. From Pancho and Lefty Ride Again by Conal Creedon. Follow your nose. A sleepy Saturday morning on Half Moon Street, and just around the corner, Christmas. I'm walking off a bit of self-inflicted pain. You know how it is. 3 days on the Rantan. 3 whole days drinking me seasonal bonus. You know how it is. When the belly's had a skinful, the mind is willing, but the body isn't able. Well, that's how it is. Just out for a scove, myself on me own, no particular place to go. Just following me nose. Just follow your nose. That's what me granda used to do. A great man for following his nose was me granda. On me mother's soul, he could find his way to work blindfolded, all the way from his front door step up on Dublin Hill, down into the belly of the city, just following his nose. The first thing that would hit my granda, and he leaving the house, would be the thick country smell of cattle from the dealers' fields beyond the grotto in Blackpool, led on like a bull by the ring. He'd close his eyes and follow his nose, past the stale stench of last night's stout and cigarette smoke from the string of pubs along Dublin Street, past the Glen Hall, the full length of Thomas Davis Street. And with the first hint of crusty bread coming from the ovens of Healy's Bakery over on Great William O'Brien Street, he'd know he was at Blackpool Church. Then the sweet smell of molten sugar, The Shawleys making toffee apples up on Gerald Griffin Street would carry him past the oak casks of the distillery and onto the Watercross Road. Ah, pleasure. A pleasure cut short by the piercing, deathly, toxic, foul cloud coming from the slaughterhouse off Denny's Lane. But then, just for a whiff of a second, the subtle scent of sherbet, drifting down from Linehan's sweet factory, would carry him past the putrid pelts of the tannery and on to the first taste of human waste on Poolraddy. Turning right onto Leitrim Street, there'd be no mistaking the warmth of the moist malt of brewing stout billowing from Murphy's stack. He knew then he was on the right track, so he put the hands into his pockets and whistle. I'm not going to whistle. Whistle all the way from Poolraddy Harbour to the home farm stores, eyes wide shut. And though still out of sight at the corner of Pine Street, the River Lee and Corrals Quay would come in descent, high at low tide, low at high tide. Wouldn't turn left nor right, but keep on straight to 3 Points Corner, where Devonshire Street, Leitrim Street and Coburg Street melt into one. He'd stay right on track, being passed from scent to scent like a baton in a relay race, spurred on by the aromatic blending of Moore's vegetables, Griffin's shoemakers, Noreen's apple tarts. Must be Friday, 'cause there's Kippers and Creedon's, O'Connell's butchered beef and O'Sullivan's cured bacon. At Falvey's Corner, he'd stop dead, struck by a tidal wave of fishy smells from the Baltimore stores, enough to knock a horse. And for the first time on his scove, my grandad opened his eyes, look back at the eastern face of Shandon, where 7:30 means 25 to 8. Then, turning right onto Bridge Street, the fine wines and exotic spices of Madden's would carry him cross Patrick's Bridge, through the gateway of the city, all the way to work, just by following his nose.
Just say one thing, basically, like Madeline, Danielle, John Breeden, and Patricia, like they're the holy trinity. And my sons were never great, right? Of Cork writers, and really much appreciated. And Rosie's played a blinder, absolutely brilliant.
Michael stood by the river and he looked up, and there they all were, somewhat unexpectedly, lined up along the hill. He could see their upper windows and roofs above the trees. Where the River Lee breaks into two, they follow the North Channel for a mile or more, starting with Our Lady's Asylum, and then the red bricks of St. Kevin's Asylum, and the Old City Jail, and the Magdalen Laundry of the Good Shepherd Order, and St. Finbarr's Industrial School for Girls, and the orphanage alongside it, all facing down onto the river and the land and the city that filled them, and way up the crosses of their steeples and were sparse and bent like abandoned graves in the sky. He took off his shoes and set them down, and he rolled down his socks and pulled them off and put each of them into his shoes and left them there at the river edge. He rolled his pants to his shins and dipped his toes in the water. He looked up over the trees to all the glassless black in those buildings, and he thought of all the terrible eyes that must have looked out from them once. And he thought of his mother's eyes. He stood up and walked into the river to his knees, and he looked down into the water, and he could not see himself for the murk, and he put his hand in his pocket and took out her wedding ring, and he closed his fist around it and slowly dropped his hand down into the water, and he left it there for a while, just looking at it. Then he opened his hand. It stayed for a moment on his palm. Then the current stood it upright, and then it was gone. He stood up and faced down to where the river ran slow and silent away behind some trees, and he thought of where the river joined up again on the other side of the city and carried on out to where it started dropping silt and bodies and memory. They could find a ring out there someday, he thought, when he was gone and the yet unborn were gone. Some kids by the shore of Blackrock Castle, or a man with a dog by the rocks over in Passage West. They'd wipe it clean on a shirt end and finger it on a palm and read the engraving on the inside. It would read, "My baby, always." And they would not know the woman who wore it, that she'd carved him in silver and turned him over a knuckle and wore him always against her finger flesh. A child of gene and past and bone and blood, a child of man and man's God, a child of Ireland who lived and was loved and held by a mother in that country. And they would not know he had no grave, for he was bastard, and that there were many, many like him. She has the whole pool to herself. She has seen the others off, the rugby players in for their recovery swim who splash around for 20 minutes and then retire to the sauna, the slow, steady pensioners who breaststroke endless laps. Beth counts them leaving, one by one, as she sluices through the water, flipping tautly at each end. It will never leave her, she thinks, the need to swim. The dart passes on the bridge that stretches over the complex, momentarily turning the pool nightclub dark. She breaches the surface to adjust her goggles. The lifeguard makes eye contact and then looks pointedly at his watch. She swims another 5 laps before getting out, her skin drum tight. It feels illicit somehow, being alone in the water. No coach towering over her at the pool's edge, saying, surely she can do better than that. Now she does as she likes. After 100 laps, she feels calm and rejuvenated, her body pinging with the tremors of exercise, an old, good feeling. She started again last winter, doubtful at first, not telling anyone, poking the pool's calm surface with a toe as if testing a bath for temperature. But as soon as she slipped into the water, she felt her body relax in a way it hadn't in months. It wasn't the act of swimming that had been the problem, it turned out. It was everything around it. It was the spectre of her potential rippling after her, impossible to shake off. Her new on-campus apartment is opposite the sports complex. Her bedroom overlooks the climbing wall with its brightly coloured footholds. This morning, she sat in her window and watched. It was raining, and it seemed as if the climbers were in danger of being engulfed by the raindrops that streaked down her window. Later, she will fall asleep to the rumble of the dart and, she imagines this part at least, the slosh of water in the dormant pool. She crosses the street to her new home, her wet hair hardening in the autumn breeze. Her mother was hurt when Beth announced her intention to move into Halls an hour by train up the coast from the family home. It would have been possible, she supposes, to commute, but the room came with the sports scholarship. This is a chance for independence, however fleeting, and she owes it to herself. So far, she's only had fleeting glimpses of Sadie, her assigned roommate, who's perpetually on her way out to the various orientation week activities, treasure hunt, table quiz, giant Jenga, that Beth is too shy to attend on her own. But in some ways, they are already on intimate terms. The shower drain is thatched over with Sadie's dark red hair. The bathroom cabinet, full of palettes and butters and serums that Beth can hardly identify, much less apply. Her wheelie suitcase and assorted cardboard boxes stand in a loose ring on the bedroom floor like a Neolithic monument. She considers the window, the narrow bed, the empty shelves. The room is a clean slate. "10 minutes later, we were at Euston Square. To my surprise, a small crowd was milling on the path outside the address. This was going to be a big one. The house itself was not as grand as it looked from the outside. The ceiling cornices in the foyer were peeling paint, the Turkish pattern carpet was shabby and stained, and the mirrors were so smoke-worn and convex that everyone, even Sybil, reed-like Sybil, looked mampsy in reflection. Poor Eva disregarded the mirrors entirely, so she was spared their withering criticism. "They're taking their time about letting us in," Sybil said. "Setting up the room, I suppose." "Setting up the room," Eva repeated mockingly. "What a farce! What frauds!" Nobody paid attention to her. I scanned the crowd, nearly all of them women. Their interest was focused on the far corner of the hall, where a very tall and tanned man in late middle age held forth to his followers in a high-pitched, reedy tone. He was bespectacled and wore a red neckerchief and had a look I'd often seen on older white men, an air of scattered absent-mindedness that barely concealed a proprietorial, controlling presence. I could tell he was used to being recognized too. Beside him stood a girl the same age as ourselves, fashionably dressed in an outfit, an olive green wool drop waist dress that made her look a bit too old for her years. Her hair was auburn, like Sybil's, though duller, and she had a square jaw and piercing eyes that never left the man. "Who are they?" I asked Eva. "That is Mr. Yeats, the famous poet. The woman is Miss Hyde Lees. She's supposed to have designs upon him. She follows him to every séance in London." "Him? Her?" I explained, "but he's old enough to be her father." "Perhaps She would have found a younger man, Eva said, were they not all dead. True, true, I murmured automatically, sensing another of Eva's rants about the horrors of war on the flapping of my hand at her in warning. But then I stopped mid-gesture and promptly forgot about Mr. Yates, the would-be Mrs. Yates, and everybody else, because behind the poet hovered a handsome man. Mr. Yates is equal in height, with broad shoulders and close-cropped hair. He wore a wool jacket with a pink handkerchief peeking out of the breast pocket. His mouth was serious, but his eyes smiled and turned slightly downward, as if sharing a confidence about something ridiculous. When my eyes met his, the smiling look suddenly dimmed, and he looked down and away, cut-eye, interlacing his fingers and bending them back. Oh, and did I mention he was black?
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you for that lovely reading.
I'm going to read an extract from my book now to give Rosie a rest. Okay, from The Art of Falling. The chalk sculpture stood in the middle of the room. It had achieved notoriety some years before, when it came to be regarded as embodying fertility powers. The public had sought it out in their hundreds. They came in a spirit of supplication, less to marvel at what critics had described as the piece's gritty transcendence, its alien, unsettling beauty, than to plead their case. Nessa walked over and touched a hand to the swell of the figure's belly. The sculpture had once languished for a period in a disused cowshed in Clonakilty before the farmer, reportedly tired of it, delivered it by tractor and trailer back to the Loch women, Robert Loch being dead by then. Nessa touched a finger to the indent in the centre of the chalk-white belly. A groove had formed from the already water-damaged gypsum being eroded by the hands of pilgrims. Nessa wondered about these people who'd flocked not to consider Robert Loch's genius but to beg for babies. She had rescued the sculpture from such indignities. But when the gallery had set about acquiring it, parts still had a dungish tinge from the years in the cowshed. The conservationist had spent days with a small brush, engaged in the complicated process of cleaning without erasing. When she was younger and a student of art history, Nessa had written her thesis on Loch. There were many theories on why the sculpture didn't have a face, and she had critically analysed all of them. Looking at the figure now, she was no nearer to understanding why Loch had left the head as a block of unchiselled stone, and yet made one foot so miraculously detailed that even now, all these years later, after all the erosions of air and cow breath, all the indignities of Loretta's cleaning solvents before she knew better, it was still possible to see the trace of a hair on the big toe and the amphibian webbing of the two smallest ones. Thank you.
It seemed like the whole world had slowed down, but Lindsay's heart was hammering in her chest. The little girl in the faded yellow dress was the only other thing that was moving too fast. Her eyes were glued to the abandoned football, and her hands were almost on it by the time Lindsay broke formation and ran towards her. She was almost sure it was Lenny's voice she heard, screaming the 3 little letters that were spinning around inside her head, but never quite made it past her lips. I-E-D. Of course, she didn't reach the little girl on time, and as she looked down on herself, lying on the ground, she could still hear the high-pitched squeal that some people call a ringing in your ears. She could hear Street's voice calling for the APC to come back, and she could hear its engines roaring as it tore into reverse. Lindsay! She was looking down on her. She wasn't looking down on herself anymore. She lying on the ground now with Lenny leaning over her, calling her name. Lindsay, he shouted at her. Get that fucking APC back here now, he roared to anybody who could hear him. She turned her head to see a little arm limp on the ground. The sleeve of the faded yellow dress was no longer yellow, and neither the arm nor the dress was still attached to the curious little girl. A man, hunched over with one hand resting against the remains of a car, turned to look at Lindsay. The man was Street, and as he moved, she caught a glimpse of the ruin beneath him, which was once a child. It felt as though her lungs would burst into flames while Lenny held her face in his hands and turned her head to look at him, just as his own jerked violently and the life immediately left his eyes. She woke to the sound of her own piercing scream amidst Frank's barking. His paws were on her chest, and as her screaming finally subsided, Frank too became more still. Lindsay just about managed to roll onto her side to avoid choking on her own vomit. She was destroyed. Her bed was destroyed, and Frank was destroyed, though he never let on if he was bothered by this. Instead, he kept his head against her until such time as she was able to move. 15 minutes or thereabouts, and when she finally sat up, he walked to the bedroom door and waited for her to open it and leave the house like she always did. But she didn't this time. She barely had the strength in her legs to carry her to the bathroom, where she turned on the shower and crawled into the bath. She sat with her knees pulled tight against her chest, and as the hot water pummeled her, she cried until she threw up again. When enough time had passed to remove all traces of warmth, she lifted her head to look into the eyes that never left her. His muzzle was leaning on the rim of the bath, and he too was whimpering softly. Knowing that Frank was the only one who would ever see her like this was what gave her the strength to finally put herself to her feet and step out of the bath. And now, from A Very Strange Man by Alana Hopkin. In 1986, Alana Hopkin was a writer in her 30s living in Kinsale, unattached. Her friend, the poet Derek Mahon, another Kinsale resident, was expecting a visit from the novelist Aidan Higgins. Derek asked if I would help him to entertain Higgins, who was due any day. It was late October, but still dry and sunny. Kinsale looked gorgeous in the autumn colours, grey stone buildings against a blue sea. He's coming down by helicopter, was the latest news from Derek, followed by no sign of Higgins, and days later, Still no sign of Higgins, and now they've cancelled the helicopter service. Another week went by. Stan rang to let me know he'd be back from London on Wednesday and invited me to dinner that night in the captain's cabin. Minutes later, Derek rang. Higgins was arriving on Wednesday. Could I join them for a dinner? I apologised and said I'd see them on Thursday. We agreed to meet as usual in the pool at Acton's Hotel around 6 o'clock. I remember having wet hair after my swim and being too impatient to dry it, suddenly curious to see what this Higgins looked like. Suppose, I thought idly, he turns out to be someone significant in my life, and his first view of me is of an otter-like wet head. I dismissed this uncharacteristic romantic thought from my thoroughly rational mind and headed for the bar. And there he was, in a wine red wool sweater, medium height and build, long reddish-brown hair, granny glasses, slightly stooped, engaged in close conversation with an enormous bear of a man called Sven. Derek must have made the introductions, I do not remember, but I do remember Sven's handshake almost breaking my bones, while the touch of Higgins' hand was like velvet. Neither Sven nor Higgins were entirely sober. Sven was a sea captain, Higgins told me in that extraordinary voice, who had killed a man at sea in the course of his duties. Derek had chosen to dine at the Shipwreck, a new place just behind the hotel. He did not drink, so Higgins and I quickly agreed on a bottle of Rioja. The pizzas were the worst any of us had ever tasted. Tomato gloop topped by processed cheese and ham. Derek knew Aidan and I both had strong opinions about the writer Malcolm Lowry. I listened to Aidan telling me this theory that his Canadian friend had about Lowry, that in Under the Volcano he had completely misunderstood the political situation in Mexico. And I liked the way he stood up for his friend's insight when I contradicted it. I liked the way he took me seriously and didn't flirt. Higgins ordered another bottle of Rioja, at which point Derek politely said goodnight and left. We first kissed in the car park, and Aidan's glasses fell apart. Mine often did the same, and I was able to retrieve the pieces and put them together. Aidan was struck dumb with admiration by my technical wizardry. I noticed that his eyes were hazel, exactly the same colour as mine. It was like looking into my own soul. The thunderbolt struck. I took his hand and led him to the car and drove the 1.5 miles home. We stayed in bed until the following afternoon and did not see Derek again until Saturday. A nice pair, was his amused greeting as we knocked contritely on his door. We had come to collect Aidan's things. We were moving in together. Collins entered the hall of his third-floor apartment and closed the door behind him. He left his keys on the coat hook and went into the living room. The usual soft light seeped up from Pope's Quay and Lavitt's Quay below. He paired his phone to the Bluetooth speaker and selected "The Safety of the North." The elegiac notes swelled and filled the room, the satisfying welcome home of familiar music. He took a bottle of pale ale from the fridge, flipped off its cap, picked a glass from the shelf and sat down in his father's old armchair in the bay window. It faced to the northwest, towards Grana Braher. The Church of the Assumption, impassive at night, stood elemental above the rows of small sleeping homes scattering out around it. In the distance, the headlights of a solitary car appeared and disappeared, almost magically, crawling down Cathedral Road. As he poured the beer, he noticed in the corner of his eye a brief orange flash from the back of a van parked on the street below, with its dirty rear mirrors faced directly towards his apartment. Young lovers, maybe. Surely they could have found a better spot. Or some guy down on his luck, homeless. Better check all the same. He placed the glass and bottle on the table, moved away from the window, and paused the music on his phone. He picked up the binoculars from the low bookshelf and, standing as far back as possible from the window, he focused them on the van. The tiny but unmistakable glow of a cigarette being pulled upon shone and faded. He noted the registration number and called the station. "Mick, Collins here," he said. "Detective Collins," Sergeant Mick Murphy said with clipped asperity, his voice as tight as new rope. They went back a long way, and the road had been rocky. "Mick, can you run a number for me, please? A Ford Transit van, white, maybe cream, O2C 97412. It's parked out across from me on Pope's Quay." "Right, I'll call you back," Mick said. "Thanks." He put the binoculars to his eyes again and waited for the call. The phone rang. "Collins," he answered. "It belongs to a garage off Blackwater Road. Shawnee McDonough runs it. Remember him? We got him for procuring a few years ago." Collins winced. He tried to think. He watched the van. It seemed so innocuous. "Is there a problem, Collins?" Mick said. "I'm not sure," he said. "There's somebody inside it." "Yeah, I remember him all right." "Thanks, Mick. Are the traffic cameras on Christie Ring Bridge, the one facing west down Pope's Quay?" "I think so. I didn't hear of any problems." "Good, thanks. I'm coming into the station to have a look. Will you send a car around, please? It's probably nothing, but still." Collins hung up. Shawnee McDonough. Not good. Not good at all.
Thanks so much, Madeleine. Thanks, Danielle, for organising this wonderful event. Thanks, Rosie, for brilliant reading. Special thanks to Patricia, Ali, and all the organisers of the festival. Patricia just told me this is the 38th event of the festival.
Wow. Liv runs a B&B with her mother, Ethel, in the village of Coolaroon. At a prayer service at the local grotto for their elderly guest who died tragically, she remembers the summer of the moving statue when she and her twin sister, Marianne, were 8 years old. It was all anyone at school could talk about. 3 of the girls were down at the grotto on Sunday evening and saw the statue moving. Not so much moving, Bernadine Burke said in her tone low and mysterious, but sort of swaying, like she was humming along to music only she could hear. It didn't surprise Liv that Bernadine Burke would know what was in the Virgin Mary's head. She knew everything else that was going on after all. That time that Mrs. Lynch was caught kissing someone who wasn't Mr. Lynch. Bernadine had the whole story within an hour. The 3 girls who had had the vision were not in school that day. Traumatised, Bernadine said. But by the time they came back on the Wednesday, the story had only grown in size and scale. 2 more people, adults and therefore unassailable, swore they had seen the Virgin moving on the Monday afternoon, in broad daylight no less. Such was the faith in their story that the school principal, Sister Eucharia, held a special assembly, calling the girls up in front of the whole school to lead them in a rosary for special intentions. Liv was mortified for them. Imagine having to stand up there with everyone gawping at you while you hoped you didn't count the wrong number of Hail Marys. She would rather poke her own eyes out. Liv peeked through her fingers at the 3 of them standing there, as ordinary as anything. Mags picked her nose in the yard. Kathy would pinch you as soon as look at you. And Louise was rumoured to wear the same knickers for 2 days at a time. The vision suddenly began to seem less miraculous and more like something that could impose itself terrifyingly on the least of them. The surest way not to see the statue move, Liv decided, was not to see the statue at all. Luckily, Ethel was of the same mind. Hysterical nonsense, was all she said whenever the topic came up. But Ethel gave in one evening. Down at the grotto, it was like being at a carnival. Liv held tight to her father's hand as they pushed their way to the spot by the wall. While they waited, she made sure to keep her back to the statue. Beside her, she heard a teenage boy tell his younger brother that he wouldn't see anything because he hadn't made his first Holy Communion yet. Jesus doesn't know you exist until then, he said with certainty. Was it true? Liv wondered. She and Marion had made their first communion 2 short months earlier. The white dresses and little handbags containing their prayer books and rosary beads. The wafer melting on her mouth. She closed her eyes and wished with all her might that Jesus hadn't told Holy Mary where she lived.
So that was our final reading of the afternoon. Thank you so much, Rosie, for those amazing readings. And just to say thanks again to Patricia Looney of Cork City Libraries. We've thoroughly enjoyed being part of Cork World Book Festival. Thanks John Breen of Waterstone Sound. And to everybody at St. Peter's who have looked after us so well, and what a wonderful venue this is this afternoon. Thank you.
And can we please thank John McLaughlin for taking over at short notice and dealing with our wine and our drink. I want to thank Andrew Lane for sorting out all of the projections and projectioning. I want to thank Dominic Moore, our wonderful filmmaker here. Thank you, Dominic. We want to thank our sponsors at Fiction at the Friary, the Arts Council, Cork City Council, the School of English at UCC, J. Rapa O'Mara Solicitors, Hogan Architects, Mike Darcy of the Friary Bar, and we want to thank all of you very, very much for being here, and we want to thank all of the wonderful writers who have come here and consented for their work to be read today. Thank you.